Bonjour mes amis, or welcome friends, hello, welcome to Brett's Table. It continues to be extremely warm here in Minnesota, so one of these days you might just find me in an apron and shoes, of course, because, safety first. So today I'm going to show you how easy it is to make a tart dough and then to form that tart dough into a tart shell. So what we're going to do here is a couple of things. One, I have my food processor bowl on a scale. Because it's much easier if you weigh things than if you try to measure them out using cups and teaspoons and tablespoons. So all you have to do, you could do this by hand as well, but the food processor is easier. So all you have to do is set your food processor bowl with the metal blade on a scale, and you set it to 0. And then I weighed out 165 grams of unbleached all-purpose flour. Then you tare it back to 0. Then I added 30 grams of cake flour. So this is the non-self-rising cake flour, and I use some of this to add, more volume of flour, but this has very low gluten, so that you've got more volume but not as much gluten formation, because gluten is great if you're making bagels, but it's not so great when you're making pie or tart dough. Then I have a tablespoon of granulated sugar, I think a half a teaspoon of kosher salt, and 1/8 of a teaspoon of baking powder. And that's a trick that I learned from my friend Kathy, who was the neighbor of Simca Beck over in Provence. So what we're going to do, so I have all the ingredients in the bowl, and I'm going to get rid of my scale. And set my bowl on my food processor. Get my lid. And just pulse this to combine all the ingredients. Okay. Then I have 3.5 ounces of butter that I've cut up into small pieces, and I'm just going to scatter these around the bowl of the food processor. So I found that 4 ounces, 8 tablespoons is too much, because the butter would end up just melting out onto my cookie sheet. So I have 7 tablespoons or 3.5 ounces of butter that I just pulse until all the butter is evenly distributed in my bowl. Okay, so unlike pie dough, you don't want to have any large pieces of butter visible, because it's just, like I said, it's going to melt out. So, and you don't want that. So now I have 1 large egg yolk that I have whisked with a tablespoon of heavy cream. So I'm going, and you notice that I kind of moved all of the flour up towards the center of the bowl. Some recipes say, with the machine running, pour your liquid through the feed tube, while the while your food processor is mixing. But what I found is that then you end up with a lot of the liquid around your blade that doesn't get incorporated. So I just pour it around the outside of the bowl. And since there's so little, I want to make sure that I get all of the liquid out and into where it needs to be. So then I process it again until it starts coming together. And sometimes you might need a little more liquid. So just depending on how dry your flour is. So I'm going to add no more than another tablespoon. But even that, I can show you in a minute that you could add a little more. It's not the end of the world, but you don't want to add too much because then you're going to have negative consequences down the road. And you notice that I didn't combine it completely because if you make it into a ball in the food processor, then you might end up with a tough dough, again, because you've created too much gluten. So I'm going to remove my food processor, and I'm going to dump this onto my cold surface. You can use coriander if you have a coriander counter. A wood butcher block you could use, but I find marble or a granite or something that stays cold much more preferable, especially in this weather, because you don't want your butter to melt. That's the trick. So now I'm going to take this and with the palm of my hand, I'm going to finish incorporating this into a dough. And this, you do it by hand because you've got more control. You're not creating, again, so much gluten. And this is called frisage. And like I said, you could do all of this by hand in a bowl and then tip it out of your bowl. And you just finish incorporating it. And then you form it into a disc. And you wrap it in food film. Got some food film here. Just wrap it up. And this goes into the refrigerator. It's better, you can leave it for as little as an hour or as long as overnight. I've got some already made that I'm going to show you now how to roll out. Or you could wrap this again and put it in the freezer, and it would keep, 3 months easily to use later. So this is going to go into the refrigerator. This is a handy tool. It's called a bench scraper, which is great to clean your countertops, to help pick up the dough, etc. So now I saw a different way. I usually roll out dough between 2 pieces of parchment paper. I know sometimes people will roll it out directly on their countertop. using flour, because you don't want your dough to stick. But what happens then is you're incorporating more flour into your dough, which again dries it out. You're creating more gluten. So I usually roll it out between two pieces of parchment paper because you don't need any flour because it's not going to stick. But then, like I said last week, I've been watching a lot of cooking shows, and chef that I saw is actually, he rolls his out between two pieces of plastic wrap. So I'm gonna see if that will work. So here we go. I've only done it once and it worked great. So let's see if we can do it again. So I'm gonna take and get another piece of parchment, another piece of plastic wrap. And set it on my counter. And then I've got the dough that I made yesterday, and it's been in the refrigerator overnight. So just gonna remove that, spread out my plastic wrap. Oops, unstick it. Maybe this is why I don't use plastic. Everything sticks. Anyway, so put this on top. Take my rolling pin. I like this rolling pin that's just a big dowel, basically. Doesn't have any ball bearings. And I start, and now I can just move the whole thing around. Roll out my dough. The dough has been sitting out for about 20 minutes. You don't want it too soft because then it's just a mess to try to roll out. You don't want it too hard, otherwise you can't roll it out. So you do need to, on occasion, just unstick it. Otherwise you're going to just have creases, and it's easier if you. So I think the jury's still out whether plastic is better than parchment paper, but we'll keep going. So I've got a stack of tart pans. I just know this is 8 inches. This is an 8-inch tart ring, which is a little more difficult to maneuver. So this is a 9 inches, which I'm going to use. This is also a 9-inch, 10-inch. Oh, this one is a very old one that used to belong to Julia Child that I was gifted one of my visits, and as well as that one. So I don't use those they're except for food styling. So I just want to make sure, yep, that should be fine. So I'm going to unstick the plastic again. See, it works out pretty good. I've got my tart pan here. So now, how do you get your tart dough into your tart pan? That's always the trick. So I'm going to take my hand underneath here and go, and it kind of worked. So what I'm going to do is just take some of this dough and put it on this side. See, it's very easy. You know, like Julia said, never let them see you sweat. And there's always a way to fix anything. We're just going to set that aside. So you just go around now with your dough and form it into your tart shell. And just keep going around and around. That's a lot of dough there, so I'm going to pick it up and put it back on the side, and just you fold down any excess that you have. And you know, it just takes, you know, a little bit of time. It's not rocket science. You know, if one piece is thicker than the other, you just take and move it around to even out. You know, you can feel with your fingers which is thick and which is thin. So you just move it around, pressing it in. Until it's all the same thickness all the way around. And you know, it takes a little bit of time to do this. Sometimes, you know, after this is done, you see that people will take their rolling pin and swipe it across the top, which then it leaves grooves in your rolling pin, which I wouldn't like. And plus, I always leave the dough a little higher than the tart pan because sometimes your tart will be known to shrink in the pan. So if it's a little bit higher, it is less likely to shrink so much that your filling won't, you'll have too much filling than you have space for it in your tart pan. So that's all there is to it. If you want to get really fancy, you can take a knife and go around the top and do a decorative edge. Also, you take a fork and you dock it so that if you have to blind bake your tart, and blind baking, we can talk about that. Blind baking is when you bake the tart shell without anything in it, and then after it's baked, after that is when you fill it. So what I do is I take a piece of parchment paper and I would line the tart shell. I will put this in the freezer. So say put this in the freezer, bring it back out, wad up a piece of parchment paper, line it into my tart shell, and then I have a cookie tin full of chain. So these chain is not just for your swing set, but I had the folks at the hardware store cut these into 1 foot lengths. So after I have my parchment paper lined in my frozen tart shell, I would line it with my chain and then bake it off. You can also use dried beans or uncooked uncooked rice. So dried beans or uncooked rice is just as a pie weight. so that you don't have your tart shell, puffing up as it bakes. So you've got to have some sort of weight to keep the tart shell down while it's cooking. So that's that. So that's my pie weight. This tart shell is going to go into the freezer and let it freeze, literally, before I proceed. So after it's frozen and baked off, then I have a blind baked tart shell in a 9-inch tart, and today I'm headed to a pool party this afternoon, so I'm going to make yet another recipe using rhubarb, and it's going to be probably maybe rhubarb, strawberry, blueberry custard tart. So that's all there is to making a tart shell. I like tarts better than pies. I like the ratio of filling to crust in a tart more so than a pie, unless the pie is a double crust. Apple tarts, pumpkin tarts, nut tarts, fruit tarts. We're in summer and peaches are coming up. Raspberries will be here in a couple of weeks. Peaches will be here in August. So there's all kinds of fruits and that are available for your summer tarts, and then we go into fall and we have pumpkin and apple and just more deliciousness. So appreciate everybody watching today. Try to stay cool. Anybody have any questions? If not, let's stay at this. Please wear your mask. It doesn't look like I'm going to be going to Florida anytime soon. Was wanting to go to California. I definitely want to get back to France and see my friends there. We've got sour cherries coming into season right now, so a sour cherry tart would be delicious. So thanks everyone. Live well. Eat well, and I think next weekend I'm going to be self-isolating down in Chicago, so we'll see if we can do some sort of cooking demo down in Chicago. So thanks everyone, and have an amazing day. So bye now.